Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, both in person and remotely, for St. Thomas More College's 33rd Annual Michael Keenan Memorial Lecture. My name is Tammy March, and I'm a faculty member in the Psychology Department at STM, and I'm currently serving as STM's Dean. As I speak to you from STM's auditorium this evening, I'd like to acknowledge that I, along with all of us in the auditorium, as well as some of you online, are on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. Some of you are joining us from other traditional homelands and territories. As we continue our work on reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge, respect, and reaffirm our relationship with our First Nations and Métis ancestors, and to all the Indigenous peoples in Canada who have given us the privilege of using these lands. I wish everyone safe, fruitful, and respectful encounters in these territories and homelands. The Keenan Lecture is STM's signature academic event, and we are very happy to be able to hold this lecture in person this year, which we haven't been able to do since 2019, and to be able to live stream it as well. The Keenan Lecture commemorates and celebrates the life and achievements of Dr. Michael Keenan, who was born in 1937 and died in 1986. Mike completed a BA and master's degree in psychology at Assumption University in Windsor, Ontario in the early 60s, after which he worked for the Ontario government for a year, assisting patients at the psychiatric hospital in St. Thomas. Mike then taught developmental psychology for 2 years at King's College, now King's University College, which is affiliated with the University of Western Ontario. Mike first came to STM on the invitation of Father Peter Swan in 1965, who was serving as principal of STM at the time. Father Swan had been at Assumption University a few years earlier as registrar, which is how we knew Mike. However, after 2 years at STM, Mike, his wife Pat, and their young family went back to Ontario so that he could pursue his doctoral studies in psychology at the University of Waterloo. He taught sessionally as a graduate student in developmental psychology while he finished his graduate work. When he finished his PhD, he came back to STM, and that was in 1971. In addition to teaching courses in developmental psychology, he served as head of the psychology department, and within 4 years was appointed as the dean, the first dean of STM. He served in that role from 1975 to 1985. Throughout his years as dean, Mike remained dedicated to his students and loved teaching in the field of child psychology. He was known for the quiet leadership he provided to STM, for his insistence on high academic standards, and for the humor and affability which characterized his public and private life. Pat, along with one of their 3 children, as well as some grandchildren, a couple of grandchildren, have remained in Saskatoon, and they have become a part of the life of the college. We are fortunate to have Pat and Mike and Pat's son Terry joining us this evening. We just all had supper together. It was great. Thank you for being here with us this evening. And I know that we also have other members of the Keenan family watching the lecture online. To commemorate Mike's close bond with STM, the Keenan family, Pat, along with Mike's twin brother Robert, with the assistance of STM's Board of Governors and faculty at the time, established this annual lecture. The lecture takes place each fall on a date close to the anniversary of Mike's death on October 31st. And we've been privileged to listen to leading intellectuals and leaders from various fields since the first lecture in 1987. Through all these years, this lecture has become a celebration not only of Mike Keenan's service and dedication to our college, but also of the Keenan family's commitment to what our college stands for, an intellectual synthesis of faith and reason. It has been the mission of this lecture to invite scholars to give presentations that explore this relationship. In that sense, Pat and her family have remained an essential part of the STM family and its mission. For that, we are very grateful, Pat. And as we have done in the past, so this will come as no surprise, we have a small token of our appreciation to you and your family. And we're very happy to be able to give this to you in person this year. And I should be able to see where Pat is. There she is, at the back. Thanks again, Pat and the Keenan family. Dr. Charles Smith, who is a faculty member in the STM's Political Studies Department, will now introduce our 33rd Michael Keenan Memorial Lecturer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy, and Thank you so much for everyone that's come out tonight. It's an honor to be able to introduce tonight's guest speaker, and I really do enjoy doing this for multiple reasons. The one is to see such incredible speakers that we get to the college, and the other is to remind myself that if I ever get to big ahead, I'm reminded of the people who are doing incredible things out there that I will never have the opportunity to accomplish. So it's quite an honor to introduce tonight's guest speaker, the Honourable Graydon Nicholas, who is Maliseet from Tobique First Nation in New Brunswick. And I had the opportunity when I was reading your CV, Mr. Nichols, to look at the website of your homeland, and I must admit it is a beautiful country that I would like to visit, or a beautiful part of the country that I would like to visit one day. Mr. Nichols earned his BSc degree from St. X University in 1968 and graduated from University of New Brunswick, the law school in 1971, becoming the first Indigenous person in Atlantic Canada to earn a law degree. He received a Master of Social Work degree from Wilfrid Laurier in 1974, and he received 4 honorary degrees from St. Xavier University in 1994, Wilfrid Laurier University in 2002, Mount Allison in 2010, and the University of New Brunswick in 2015. He was the first Indigenous Provincial Court judge in New Brunswick, serving from 1991 until 2004, and he served as New Brunswick's first Indigenous Lieutenant Governor from 2009 until 2014. In these roles, he advanced initiatives to improve conditions in First Nations communities and championed better education for Indigenous youth and respect for Indigenous traditions. Graydon was a member of the Aboriginal Council of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops from 1998 until 2004. He helped in the creation of the National Day of Prayer for Aboriginal People for Canada, which began on the 12th of December, 2005. He has received numerous awards recognizing his long-standing community service, including the New Brunswick Human Rights Award, the Fredericton YMCA Peace Medallion, the 125th anniversary of the Confederation of Canada Medal, and the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal. He and his wife, Beth, are members of the Christian Life community and has served as national co-presidents. He is a recipient of the Benemerante Pontifical Medal presented by the Apostolic Nuncio to Canada in 2008, and in 2020 was appointed Chancellor of St. Thomas University in New Brunswick. Please join me in welcoming Graydon Nicholas to STM. Welcome, sir.
Well, good evening, everyone. And it's nice to be gathered here in Saskatoon. And I used to come in Saskatoon way back in the 70s and 80s with a different hat as an Indigenous political movement. And I've had an opportunity to renew some of the people's relationship that I had. So when that introduction is always given, I almost say, do I know that guy? And my wife says, well, yeah, I've had a lot to do with it. So I have to give credit where credit is due. So first of all, I want to begin this lecture by expressing my gratitude for the invitation to share my reflections on this topic. And also very grateful to the family of Dr. Michael Keenan for their generosity in creating this special lecture series. And I had the privilege of sitting with their son Terrence, and I got to meet his wife as well, which was very good, to understand a little bit about the family background. And of course, I'm very humbled to be present with you here this evening. The land acknowledgement has already been recited, and I just want to thank the university for this land acknowledgement. It's a beautiful land acknowledgement, and I'm glad that your university is doing this. I want to begin my lecture this evening by a quote from Acts 10:34 to 37. Then Peter addressed them. The truth I have come to realize, he said, is that God does not have favorites, but that anybody of any nationality who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to him. It is true God sent his word to the people of Israel, and it was to them that the good news of peace was brought by Jesus Christ. But Jesus Christ is Lord of all. Pope Francis accepted the invitation to come to Canada from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops on October 27, 2001. And it was designated as a pilgrimage for healing and reconciliation. The CCCB informed the public that the planned delegation of Indigenous survivors, elders, knowledge keepers, and youth would travel to the Holy See, where they would have the opportunity to speak to Pope Francis about the timing, focus, and themes in preparation for his future pilgrimage to Canada. The date of this trip was for December 17th to the 20th, 2021. This planned trip and visit was postponed. The visit of the Vatican took place from March 28 to April 1st, 2022. Pope Francis did agree to come to Canada for July 24th to the 29th this summer, in what he called Walking Together, his apostolic journey, a penitential pilgrimage. Of course, we know that this was in response to the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, 94 calls of action, and in particular, calls to action number 58. And I just want to read that. We call upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families and communities, for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. We call for that apology to be similar to the 2010 apology issued to the Irish victims of abuse, and to occur within 1 year of the issuing of this report, and to be delivered by the Pope in Canada. Pope Francis did listen to the voices of Indigenous representatives and apologized at the Vatican on April 1st this spring. His address on April the 1st is in some of these words, and I quote, "Over the past few days, I have listened attentively to your testimonies. I have brought them to my thoughts and prayers and reflected on the stories you told and the situations you described. I thank you for having opened your hearts to me and for expressing by means of this visit your desire for us to journey together." And then he acknowledged that great harm was done to your identity and your culture. Many families were separated, and great numbers of children fell victims to those attempts to impose a uniformity based on notion that progress occurs through the ideological colonization. And then he said, listening to your voices, I was able to enter into and be deeply grieved by the stories of this suffering, hardship, discrimination, and various forms of abuse that some of you experienced, particularly in the residential schools. And then he expressed his sorrow and shame for the role that the number of Catholics, particularly those with educational responsibilities, have had in all these things that wounded you, in the abuses you suffered, and in the lack of respect shown for your identity, your culture, and even your spiritual values. All these things are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And of course, Pope Francis did agree to come visit our country. I want to mention some of the developments that I was privileged to be involved in preparation for the initial visit planned for December 7th to the 20th, 2021. the CCCB organized several committees to prepare information, materials, and liturgical homilies to begin on the feast day of Christ the King to the fourth Sunday of Advent. These very valuable resources were put on the CCCB website and sent to the dioceses across Canada. They included articles on early missionaries and the encounter of worldviews, treaties, residential schools, intergenerational effects, and reconciliation. The 5 homilies were actually recorded by Bishop Boland of this province. There are actually 11 calls of action from the TRC for Catholic churches, which include number 58. And again, I just want to read that into the record. I would like to refer to some of the historical facts which are significant to outline what was to be considered. Prior to the contact with European nations, Indigenous nations and tribes existed as developed peoples, with their own languages, populations, governments, and external relations, as well as practicing spiritualities gifted to them by the Creator. Contact with European nations resulted in monumental changes. The concept of discovery, terra nullius, and evangelization had tremendous dramatic impact. Spain began with the colonization and destruction of many Indigenous peoples. It was their mission to save the souls of Indigenous peoples in the name of Jesus Christ. However, on December the 21st, 1511, a Dominican priest, Fray Montesinos, gave a homily on the fourth Sunday of Advent in Santo Domingo with these words: "Tell me, by what right of justice do you hold these Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude? On what authority have you waged such detestable wars against these people who dwell quietly and peacefully on their own lands? Wars is which you have destroyed such an infinite number of them by homicides and slaughters never heard of before. Why do you keep them so oppressed and exhausted, without giving them enough to eat or curing them of the sicknesses they incur from the excessive labor you give them? And they die, or rather, you kill them, in order to extract and acquire gold every day." This was not the message that was expected by those attending Mass. His remarks resulted in him being sent back to Spain. He was a powerful voice in the wilderness. There were other voices who advocated for the just treatment of the Indigenous peoples. One very important voice was Pope Paul III, who issued a bull entitled Sublimis Deus on June 4th, 1537, which said in part that the Indians are truly men, and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but according to our information, they desire exceedingly to receive it. Notwithstanding whatever may have been or may be said to the contrary, the said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, and that they should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it should be null and void and of no effect. The King of Spain did not accept this papal bull. He continued to exploit and unjustly treat the Indigenous people. Evangelization began in the East Coast. The first person to be baptized was Mi'kmaq Grand Chief Membertou, along with his family and some members on July 24th, 1610. The missionaries taught him that Jesus was indigenous, true incarnation, and had a grandmother whose name was St. Anne. There is a reverence of the role and responsibilities of grandmothers in indigenous communities. He told the missionaries that he wanted them to learn the language of his people and to teach them that Jesus was a man of peace. This evangelization continued to where my ancestors also were baptized and became Catholics. Prior to the establishment of residential schools in Canada, a New England company called Society for the Propagation of Gospel in New England was established to teach Indigenous children to be civilized through education, vocational training, and conversion to Protestant religion. Schools were set up in Meductic, Fredericton, and Sussex Vale in New Brunswick between 1790 to 1826. The results were not successful, and the schools were closed. The Anglican Church, with the financial assistance of the New England Company, based in London, wanted to convert Indigenous persons from being Catholic to become Anglicans. That particular same company established the Mohawk Institute Residential School, which was an Indian residential school in Brantford, Ontario, operated by the Anglican Church from 1831 to 1922. After that, it was taken over by the Government of Canada. Canada was also influenced by the United States, who established Indian boarding schools to civilize Indian children from removing them from their reservations. Christian faiths were hired to implement this policy. The Canadian government adopted this same policy in 1884 for the removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities with the force of law enacted in the Indian Act. The attitude of government officials, such as Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, was reflected in this statement in 1883. And the quote, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way that would be put them in central training industrial schools, where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men." The TRC final report listed 130 residential schools in Canada from 1884 to 1997. In Saskatchewan, there were 20, of which 10 were Catholic. There were also 11 calls of action for the Catholic churches in Canada. 2 in particular are calls to action 48 and 49, asking the Catholic Church to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. The CCB did so on March 19, 2016. The documents were entitled "On Adopting and Implementing the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People," and also the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius. The Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See on April 27, 2010, issued a statement, "Impact on the Indigenous peoples of the international legal construct known as Doctrine of Discovery, which has served as a foundation of violation of their human rights." And I just want to quote a part of that. Regarding the question of doctrine of discovery and the role of the papal bull Inter Quatera, the Holy See notes that Inter Quatera as a source of international law, division of lands between Castile, Aragon, Spain, and Portugal was first of all abrogated by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And that circumstances have changed as much that to attribute to any judicial value of such a document seems completely out of place. In addition, it was abrogated by other papal bulls, for example, Sublimis Deus in 1537. This view was expanded upon and reinforced in Immensa Pastorium of Benedict XVI, 14th of 20th December 1741, and a number of other papal encyclicals, statements, and decrees. I wanted to outline those historical facts and developments because often the general public is not aware of them. And so in my work, of course, what I teach is what I'm sharing with you part of this presentation this evening. I will now focus on excerpts of passages of Pope Francis. And I want to apologize ahead of time that some of these quotes may be extensive. However, there is a need to understand the past as we prepare the journey together. This information set the stage for the arrival of Pope Francis on his apostolic journey, a penitential pilgrimage, on July the 24th in Edmonton. Pope Francis did apologize many times in his speeches and homilies. When he addressed the gathered as Musquoises, I'm not sure if I'm saying that or not, it's a Cree name, on July 25th, he began his address with these words. I would like to begin what I consider a pilgrimage, a penitential pilgrimage. I have come to your native lands to tell you in person of my sorrow, to implore God's forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation, to express my closeness and to pray with you and for you. We want to walk together, to pray together, and to work together, so that the sufferings of the past can lead to a future of justice, healing, and reconciliation. Sorry, man, I'm just getting a bit dry here. I don't think it's a dry air in Saskatchewan because it's a beautiful province, but probably because I'm reading so much. Pope Francis invited the Indigenous peoples to journey with our Catholic Church. It will be based on trust, truth, and sharing of our Catholic faith and Indigenous spiritualities. This sacred journey will have no shortcuts and be arduous, with major stops along the way. There is hope with many prayers and rituals which will be shared on this path. We all need to be on this journey. He further indicated at that place that an important part of this process will be to conduct a serious investigation into the facts of what took place in the past and to assist the survivors of residential schools to experience healing from the traumas they suffered. His next visit was at the Sacred Heart Church in Edmonton that afternoon. And again, these are just a couple of quotes of his speech to them. He stated, "It pains me to think that Catholics contributed to policies of assimilation and enfranchisement that resulted in a sense of inferiority, robbing communities and individuals of their cultural and spiritual identity, severing their roots and fostering prejudicial and discriminatory attitudes, and that this was also done in the name of an educational system that was supposedly Christian." And then he indicated that this liturgical symbolism, which was inside the church, reminds me of the magnificent words spoken by Pope John Paul II in this country, and I quote, "Christ animates the very center of all culture. Thus, not only is Christianity relevant to the Indian people, but Christ in the members of his body is himself Indian. And of course, those words were first spoken in Canada on September 15, 1984, by St. John Paul II. Interestingly enough, also when he went to visit Lac St. Anne later on that evening I should say, he said, "Lord, we entrust ourselves to the intercession of your mother and your grandmother, because mothers and grandmothers help to heal the wounds of our hearts." At the dramatic time of the conquest, Our Lady of Guadalupe transmitted the true faith to the indigenous people, speaking their own language and clothed in their garments without violence or imposition. Upon his arrival to Quebec City on July 27th, he met with civil authorities and representatives of indigenous peoples. I was privileged to be part of that audience, and he reminded us that, again, these few quotes. I think above all of the policies of assimilation and enfranchisement, also involving the residential school system, which harmed many indigenous families by undermining their language, culture, and worldview. In that deplorable system, prompted by the governmental authorities of the time, which separated many children from their families, different local Catholic institutions played a role. The indigenous peoples have much to teach us about care and protection for the family. Among them, from an early age, children learn to recognize right from wrong, to be truthful, to share, to correct mistakes, to begin anew, and also to comfort one another and to be reconciled. The next day, on the morning of July 29, Pope Francis met with the residential school survivors. And this is what he stated to them. "I have come in a spirit of penance to express the pain that we carry in our hearts as church for the wrong inflicted on you, not by a few Catholics who supported oppressive and unjust policies in your regard. I have come as a pilgrim, so that progress may be made in the search for truth, so that the processes of healing and reconciliation may continue, so that the seeds of hope can keep being sown for future generations, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, who desire to live together in harmony as brothers and sisters." In his final stop in Nunavut, later on that afternoon, here's what he spoke to the Inuit people. "A short while ago, I listened to several of you who were students of residential schools. Today, too, in this place, I want to tell you how very sorry I am, and I ask for forgiveness for the evil perpetrated by not a few Catholics who, in these schools, contributed to the policies of cultural assimilation and enfranchisement. I am sorry." And he told them, "Dear friends, we are here with the desire to pursue together a journey of healing and reconciliation that, with the help of the Creator, can help us to shed light on what happened and move beyond the dark past." And again he said, "Friends, keep walking upwards. Come to the light each day and be a part of a team. Do all this with your own culture and in a beautiful Inuktitut language. It is my hope and prayer that by listening to your elders and drawing from the richness of your traditions, your personal freedom, you will embrace the gospel preserved and handed down to you by your ancestors, and thus come to see the Inuk face of Jesus Christ. I bless you from my heart, and all of you I say, thank you." So, of course, as Pope Francis left Canada to return back to Rome, he had a press conference with the gathered media. One of the reporters who was Indigenous was, in fact, from Ganawaki, a Mohawk, who had asked him about the doctrine of discovery. So Pope Francis said, "Thank you for that question. I think this is a problem of all colonialism. But I want to expand on this. They were considered not only inferior, some somewhat crazy theologian even wondered if they had a soul. It is true that there were voices that spoke out, like Bartholomew de las Casas. Then this doctrine of colonization, it's true, it's bad, it's unjust, and it's still used today. Going back to the colonization of America, that of the British, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese. They are four colonial powers of which there has always been that danger, or rather that mentality of we are superior, and these Indigenous people don't matter. And this is serious. The second reporter from the Canadian press, whose name was Brittany Hobson, asked him about the use of the word genocide. And she said, "The people who heard your words of apology this past week expressed their disappointment because the word genocide was not used. Would you use that term to say that members of the church participated in genocide?" The Pope's response: "It's true, I didn't use the word because it didn't come to my mind. But I described the genocide, and I was asked for forgiveness, pardon for this activity that is genocidal. For example, I condemn this too: taking away children, changing culture, changing mentality, changing traditions, changing a race. Let's put it that way, an entire culture. Yes, genocide is a technical word. I didn't use it because it didn't come to my mind. But I described it as true. Yes, it was genocide. Yes, yes, no problem. You go ahead and say that I said yes, it was genocide. Thank you." For many of us, we're all shocked at the number of unmarked graves found on the sites of former residential schools operated by the Catholic Church. How did this happen? Why were Indigenous children forcibly removed from their families in the presence of the police? Why was there fear and condemnation of Indigenous languages, spiritual values, and traditions? Why were Indigenous children neglected, mistreated, and abused in the name of Jesus Christ? I believe that our path toward reconciliation requires us to pray and dialogue with Indigenous peoples. Pray and dialogue again, and continue to pray and dialogue with Indigenous peoples, brothers, sisters, elders, and communities, and then discern with them, guided by Our Lady of Guadalupe. When I shared the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe with some residential school survivors in 2008, they wept because they heard for the first time that between December 9th to the 12th, 1531, the Mother of Jesus appeared as an Indigenous woman to bring a message of love and hope to St. Juan Diego, an Indigenous man in his Indigenous language. They asked me, why didn't the priests and the nuns tell us about this? It would have brought us respect, dignity, and hope, rather than the pain, degradation, and abuse that we suffered. This journey will not be an easy process. There will be no shortcuts, no easy discussions, but a need for education, awareness, listening, deep prayer, and meaningful dialogue, leading to an open, ongoing discernment process that will, hopefully, result in appropriate responses. As followers of the risen Jesus, we must continue to pray, be open to learn, seek the truth, express our sorrow and hope, and move forward with determination toward reconciliation and healing. With all this important information, what is a person, community, or university to do? The title of my remarks tonight was Reflection on the Papal Visit. When does it begin and with whom? I am sure that for many of you gathered this evening, this is the first time you have heard or learned of these events and information. It must involve Indigenous persons and communities who belong to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Each of these peoples experienced residential schools in different ways. Many live in urban centers for various reasons. This will not be an easy process, but I encourage you to begin that path. This part of church history is rarely taught in our churches, schools, or universities. This earlier message of St. John Paul II on September 15, 1984, that Jesus in his own body is Indian, and echoed by Pope Francis, must not fall on deaf ears of our clergy and other Catholic leaders to understand this tragic journey of contact between Indigenous peoples and colonial powers, which began at the dawn of the 1500s. I want to repeat what Pope Francis said on July 25th. Here were his words. I would like to begin what I consider a pilgrimage, a penitential pilgrimage. I have come to your native lands to tell you in person of my sorrow, to implore God's forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation, to express my closeness, and to pray with you and for you. We want to walk together, to pray together, and to work together, so that the sufferings of the past can lead to a future of justice, healing, and reconciliation. Certain questions were posed by Pope Francis when he was at Lac Saint Anne on July 26, and I just want to read these out to you. When looking at the Indigenous peoples and thinking of their history and the pain that they endured, what do I do for Indigenous peoples? Do I merely listen with curiosity, horrified by what happened in the past? Or do I do something concrete for them? Do I pray, meet, read, support them, and let myself be touched by their stories? It does begin now for each of us gathered here this evening. Now is a good time to begin. So what's my formula? First, there is much information to read. I would recommend you that you look at these following documentations. First, the TRC's 94 calls to action. Secondly, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Third, the University Canada's Principles on Indigenous Education. 4, documents that have been prepared by the CCCB, already mentioned in my speech, and by other religious orders and institutions. 5th, papal statements and homilies of St. John Paul II and Pope Francis. 6th, apologies of the churches that were involved in the residential schools. 7, apologies of the RCMP who were involved in the removal of Indigenous children from their parents and communities. Secondly, and finally, I would encourage that on this beautiful Catholic university, you begin the process of sitting together with Indigenous representatives to begin this dialogue. The answers will be in your midst. praying together by including Indigenous spirituality and our Catholic faith in recognition of one another, because we are children of God, our Creator. Thank you very much for your presence this evening in my language, Waliwan. Thank you.
You get to stay here, though. You're on the hot seat now. So, hello. Well, thank you so much for that very interesting talk. We have some time now for some questions. My name is David McGrain. I am a professor of political studies here at St. Thomas More College. So I'll be moderating the discussion that's going to be taking place by the people in the room. Obviously, people online can listen in. So there is a mic up there over by Laura. Maybe wave your hand by Laura over there. So basically, I'll just take some questions, and then our speaker will answer the questions. And so does anybody want to start us off by asking a question? Maybe just go to the, unfortunately, we'll have to use the mic, though, for the questions, just because, yeah, the mic's over there. Just so that the people at that are listening online can hear properly. So we'll use the mic and for people in the room, obviously, to hear as well. So go ahead, ask your question, and then you can obviously take back the podium.
I don't know, is this on? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's on.
So I'm just wondering if you have been involved in the synodal process that has been going on with the church in the last 6 months or more. And is there some feedback coming through the church, through the synodal process? And I know the Western bishops created a report. I'm wondering if you're familiar with that. I haven't read it, but I should read it. But I'm wondering if that connects some of the things that have been happening with our reconciliation and where we're going.
Well, no, I haven't been involved in it, mainly because I'm so busy on other different files. I have not had the opportunity to participate in the discussions that have been held, say, in our Diocese of St. John. But I'm familiar with some of the comments that are being made now, trying to bring into the particular dialogue more about Indigenous issues, because not every particular diocese across Canada has been involved in that particular way. So I'm encouraged by that development. I think it's great. Anytime discussions take place at whatever level with the different parts of our church, I think it's very good, because it'll reach more people. And then the more people understand what happened, then I think the goal is that something like this would never, ever happen again to any other race of people. But at the same time, for us as individuals, we have to know the past. It's pretty hard to say you're sorry for something if you don't know what you're sorry about. And so, but I would encourage, again, that dialogue with others saying, okay, I want to participate in that process. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Is there some other questions there that people are, or comments that people are curious about? Yeah, if you want to just go to the mic, maybe. I just more thinking about the people at home to make sure they can hear us in our deliberations.
Thank you for your talk. Appreciate that. Taking peace studies.
Maybe if you just a bit closer to the mic. Thanks. Thanks, Carl. Yeah.
I'm taking a peace studies class and talking about reconciliation and conciliation. And we had a session, a seminar, and we had a young Aboriginal lady join us. And like she said, we had to sign the treaty because we were going to starve. And so how can there be reconciliation when there was really no conciliation in the first place is my question. So I struggle with the concept of reconciliation when the first treaties were really a forced treaty on one side and not the other. And do we need to call it reconciliation when there was really no fair conciliation in the first place? Just a second thought, it's a thought. Spain spent the summer on fire. There's very well a reason for that. I think they're going to see a lot of the stuff that they stole burn in the next 77 years. I honestly believe that. And so we're on that path, I think, in terms of the environment changing as a result of our sinful behaviors. But if you have any comments on that, or you don't, that's fine. I just thought it. Thank you.
I couldn't understand a lot of your particular comments, but I think for a lot of Indigenous peoples now, they're saying the word should not be reconciliation, but reconciliation. In other words, there has to be something that is done to make it, and it has to be led by the church, because it wasn't only just our Catholic Church who was involved in this particular colonization, in cooperation with the governments. The Anglicans, Presbyterians, United, and also the Baptists were involved in this. And so when I speak to different denominations, I tell them, well, yes, Catholics may have run the majority of them, but your particular faith was also involved. And it has to go beyond apologies. What concrete actions can we put in place? For example, a little while ago when I quoted what Pope John Paul II said in 1984, that Christ is in his own body is Indian. That goes back to what I related about Grand Chief Membertou when he was first told in 1610 that Jesus is Mi'kmaq. And any other Indigenous groups that were also came into contact with the early missionaries, that was done. And something happened from 1610 to 1884 when residential schools were set in place. Evangelization was not there. And so for a lot of this healing that has to take place within our communities, and also for actually within our church, that's going to be a process that's going to take a while, because you can't sweep that under the rug anymore. I think with the revelation of the unmarked graves, that's what shocked Canada. And that's what shocked the Catholic Church and the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. We've got to do something. So then they did. They started setting up committees. They agreed to set up this reconciliation fund that's national, and also begin to walk with Indigenous elders and spiritual leaders. But I was there listening to Pope John Paul II in 1984, and I knew what he meant. And when he also refuted the discovery by saying the words of 1537, I had done research of that in 1969 when I was a law student. So I jumped up when I heard him say those two things, and I waited for the Catholic hierarchy to do something. But unfortunately, nothing happened. So we have to teach this stuff at universities, because this is where young minds come to us. We have to tell them at least these are the factual things. The question is, what are they prepared to do with it? So that, I think, is what's crucial in this country. We are at a particular point where we say the old question of the fork on the road or the Emmaus walk. We need Jesus among us to remind us that we are brothers and sisters, walking as Christians. And so that's what's needed, in my view, from my experience with different groups I belong to. But I can't journey alone. Others have to journey together. And so how long that'll take? Well, I've waited since 1984, which is a long time. And now Pope Francis has reiterated the same thing. How long do we wait? Another 20 years? I don't know. But I hope we don't, because I don't think I'm going to live long enough for that. But thank you.
Another question? Yeah, go ahead. Just.
This is kind of follow-up on something that you said in the last response. 1884 was a pivotal moment of change in Canada, with the residential school system getting underway and that kind of thing. But what was happening between the country and the church in those hundreds of years before that in Canada? What were the pros and cons of that? You mentioned the first convert. which seemed to be a very positive way of doing things at that moment. But there seems to be a void in knowledge of that intervening period.
Well, perhaps this is not a good word to use, but I say evangelization went amok. The early missionaries forgot what began in 1610, just like the Catholic Church forgot what happened from 1537. That was the official position of Vatican. Was this ever taught, for example, at seminaries for these priests later on who came to Canada to minister to the needs of Indigenous people? Or was it like what the King of Spain said, it's nice, forget it, put it on a shelf? I can't explain that formation of faith that would have occurred to priests and in convents. I don't know. But as I quoted to you a little while ago, my cousins who responded when I went to speak in 2008, and that was quite a while ago, they said, why did not the people teach us of what you're telling us now about Our Lady Guadalupe? Why were we punished for who we were? Why were we punished for speaking our language? Why were we punished and not allowed to contact my brothers and sisters? I don't know. I don't know what these priests and nuns were taught at that time. But I know the consequences of what happened to my cousins. Even today, they still suffer intergenerationally because their children and grandchildren feel the effects of those who attended residential schools. We have to remember that there was no political voice in Canada for Indigenous people until 1960, when the government of Canada and several provinces finally recognized that Indians could actually vote. So that hasn't been that long from 1960 to be able to make an impact on governments, let alone our churches, to say that fundamental changes on justice issues have to be done. As I said, I really don't know the answers. I've studied this stuff, but I can't explain why. I mean, why did Prime Minister MacDonald say those awful words that he used? And he wasn't the only politician who said it. That's racism. We know that. But how does that justify what has happened? So I leave that question. I can't give a full answer to that. I wish there was things positive. And there were some things positive that did happen, but not much. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I really want to say I really believe in this thing about educating ourselves and learning and coming to lectures like this to learn more. And I just can't leave here without, I don't know, pointing out that St. Thomas More, I believe, helped with a particular course that is put on by the diocese here. That course is fantastic. And I mean, I took it. I did all the modules and everything else. And it's just a fantastic thing that, you know, St. Thomas More needs to really be happy about, because it's fantastic. And I think it says what our speaker is saying, education, and that's doing something. It's not just, it's actually changing hearts and minds. So thank you so much for reminding us of that.
Okay, thank you. That's more a comment than a question. But do you want to have a question, sir? Yeah, come on. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so.
Hello, I'm a student here from the university, from the college as well. I just have a question. I'm taking currently a course that is a requirement in university. It's called Indigenous Languages of Canada. It's a very interesting course. It's been very revealing of a reality that for some of us that especially were not raised in Canada, being Canadian, not raised in Canada, it's a good perspective of the things that we're not aware in regards of the things that happen to the indigenous peoples. And however, being Canadian, I have a concern for the reality of the present reality of how are we gonna deal with the issue that seems to be this diversity seems to attempt, in my perspective, in my understanding, against the unity of the Canadian being, like how to say, the Canadian identity, and also as being Catholic, raised Catholic, I would invite the distinction between the fact that probably the way the evangelization was done was not the best possible, but however, the process of evangelization itself, being Catholic, I cannot see it as being something wrong, because that's the process that creates that national identity and unity in the present. I think it's the process of evangelization is what makes us brothers and sisters in Christ. Being Catholic, that's my actual belief. And so I guess my question here is, how are we in the present dealing with that issue? How is there, from the indigenous perspective, are we working on a theology that can reconcile us together, or what's
thanks.
the situation?
So yeah, so a bit of a question about unity and diversity, how to accommodate diversity and maintain unity, and a question about, I guess, evangelization and the role that it played in the past, and was that good or bad, or those types of things. So hard questions.
Well, I'll try to answer that question. First of all, I'm glad you're Canadian. That's number one. And I think some of the stuff I've talked to you about tonight, I teach in the course I teach at the University at St. Thomas University. Well, I'll just give you an example. I started lecturing at the university in 1983, dealing with Indigenous law and some of what I had learned, what I shared with you about Pope Paul III. And at one time, when I started talking about the importance of treaties, because treaties are considered to be solemn documents. They're spiritual for our people. And so, I had a particular colleague who was teaching political science, and he was an American. So in my class on Indigenous rights, I would teach the students, give them documentation about treaties and all of this other information that I briefly spoke about here this evening. Well, when some of the students that were in my class went to see him in his class and he talked, he says, well, treaties are a fiction of imagination. That we conquered and we defeated the Indians, and he was an American, this guy, and he says the treaties are no good. So the students, of course, came to see me. He said, well, you're giving us this stuff. Who do we believe, the political scientist or you? I said, well, you can actually believe both. When I tell you there are treaty rights, I'm giving you the documentation. I can't make this stuff up. It's there in the research. And the courts in the United States have said they're valid. As early as in the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, the United States Supreme Court recognized the supremacy of treaties that were signed with the federal government, so that the state governments could not infringe on whatever rights were being negotiated and finalized. And I said, you go and tell him, here's a decision of the Supreme Court of the United States, the country he's from, and here's what the justices are saying, that treaties are valid, and that the idea of nationhood, the idea of sovereignty are English words, and that treaties can only be signed between nations. He said, you tell him that and see what he thinks of those decisions of the United States Supreme Court. Well, after they went to talk to him, nothing ever came up again. Because you see, if in other disciplines they don't know, probably he never studied, because in the United States there were Indian wars, and they defeated them. So some of the other students said, well, when you defeat somebody, they no longer exist. I said, well, that's not true. He said, why? I said, well, how many times was Germany defeated? How many times was Italy defeated? How many of these European nations were defeated? Does that mean they no longer exist? Of course, the answer is no. They do exist. Because in treaties that are negotiated between nations, they make sure that not only does a continuity exist of that particular sovereign country, but they make decisions on reparations. So that, I said, that's no different for Indian nations and tribes. It's just that it has not been a recognized fact in Canada. So it took a long while, and the professor and I agreed to disagree. I mean, that's what academic freedom is at universities, and I'm sure it's no different here than in other institution in Canada or the United States. But if you can give this information to the students, they will be the ones who will carry on. Just like what I learned back in 1969 as just a law student doing research, I was influenced. So for newcomers coming to Canada, you come to a country that has tremendous freedom. I'm not saying you, but some come from repressive areas in the countries they come from. They're not necessarily taught anything about the history of Canada. But there is a call to action in that Truth and Reconciliation that says for people coming from other countries, the newcomers, then the government of Canada has an obligation to explain to them Indigenous people and their history. Now, I can't, I mean, I don't know. I never called anybody from External Affairs to say, well, did you explain that? I don't know. I really don't. But inclusivity, if Indigenous people were as bad as history records, the moment the Europeans came to the shores, all the Indigenous people had to do was disappear into the woods, and those people would have starved to death. Because they didn't know the food, they didn't know where to get the fresh water. And so often that part of history is forgotten. The other part is Indigenous people in any country never impose their language, nor their traditions, nor their spirituality, nor their governments to the newcomers. It was the other way around. So those are lessons. If we can't look at that part of history, the effect of colonialism, like what Pope Francis says, how are we going to break away from the concepts of superiority that are out there so that Indigenous peoples are accepted as equal followers of Jesus Christ? That's the best I can do.
Yeah, we have time maybe for one or two more questions. Go ahead, yeah.
Hi. So the reactions to Pope Francis's visit were quite varied, especially among Indigenous peoples, from seen as like very healing and positive to not going far enough to actually it itself being traumatic. And I work in a high school, and I'm involved in a lot of the truth and reconciliation work that we do in the school. And I've noticed that with students and their families as well, because I work closely with the Aboriginal Student Achievement Coordinator in our school. And so when we do things publicly, sometimes there's a reaction to some students that we wouldn't have necessarily recognized because of the experience to the papal visit that the families are having. And I'm just wondering, being a public figure, if you have had experience dealing with that and how to be more proactive in an approach to support people who may feel like a struggle with what the church is doing, including Pope Francis's visit this summer. I hope I explained that well enough for you to be able to answer.
Well, you asked a very good question because you're an educator. And I think, no, I'm just saying as calm, but I think if you cannot begin to communicate with students in the high school level, or even one of the principles of the calls to act, or one of the calls to action is in fact to look at the curriculum of the schools. And who controls curriculum? It's generally the provinces. are the provinces prepared to develop new curriculum involving Indigenous people so that there is more Indigenous content in a particular class that's taught? That is controlled by the government. So they actually control what children, in fact, will be studying in the institutions in high school or even middle school. But that is one of the recommendations that are very strong, that there should be an involvement of Indigenous peoples to develop the curriculum that can be then provided in education. And that's been a big struggle all along. At the University of Prince Edward Island is a small university, but they have set up a special Indigenous learning unit. And each student at that university at UPI has to take a course on Indigenous issues. It's a requirement for them to graduate. And how many other universities in Canada would be prepared to do that? I don't know. Even at St. Thomas University, where I'm the chancellor per se, and I teach, not all students are required to do that. And so when you teach at that university setting, for example, I usually would have about 25, 30 students. 2/3 of those students never learned anything about treaty rights, Aboriginal title, never learned about Indigenous spirituality, never learned, and it goes on. So when they come into the class I teach, it's instant, you know. But that's up to the particular one who's teaching. What information do you want to give to the students? And to me, education is liberation. That's been my slogan all along since I've gone to universities, and I've gone to universities, many universities. But each time I try to teach and share, I give them the information, we discuss it. There's no way I can impose a difference in change of thought. I just ask them, I'm giving you information, what are you going to do with it? Remember those questions that the Pope said in part of his thing, what I repeated here tonight? How am I going to participate? What are the expectations? And the list goes on and on. So that's a challenge, not only to this beautiful campus, and those of you who are in the audience, there's no age criteria for when this journey starts. But let's not wait another 20 years to in fact believe that Christ is Indigenous, that Christ is Inuk, that Christ is Métis. We shouldn't have to do that. We should begin to see how can we implement this within our Catholic faith. That's my always question. And believe me, I deal with a lot of bishops in Canada, and I always challenge them. Do you remember the words of Pope John Paul II in 1984? Never heard of it. Next question is, do you remember what Pope Francis said at Sacred Heart Church in Edmonton here not that long ago? What did he say? You see, how do you engage? And I'm going to continue as much as I can with good Lord, whatever little time the good Lord has left in me. But if we don't, then who's going to do it? You know, if you don't do it, who's going to do it? So that is what I would leave with that message. And you know, today, for example, like I forget one of the, you talked about what's happening at your campus here. Today I had a chance to sit down and renew relations with a good friend of mine, Harry Lafont, who in fact is involved on your campus here. And Harry and Lafont and I were actually involved in the original Aboriginal Council that the CCB set up, what he said in the introduction. And at that time, the bishops, and Harry and I talked about that at lunch, and I said, Harry, do you remember the time when we were at this particular First Nation community in Saskatchewan? I forgot the name of it, but he told me today it was Beardy's. I hope I said that right. Did I say it right? Okay. And it's not his community, but he said, we had the pipe carrier come in the middle of the Eucharistic celebration and perform a pipe ceremony with those bishops who were celebrating Mass. I'm talking about Well, maybe 2001, 2002. And I see, because at one time they were saying anybody who practices Indigenous spirituality, you're destined to go to hell. But yet, Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis saying, no, Indigenous spirituality is important because that spirituality is a gift from God the Creator. And so how do we begin to introduce these ways of praying into our liturgies so that Indigenous people are welcome in those liturgical ceremonies, but also the non-Indigenous people there will see something that's going to enrich their own spiritual life. That's my dream, that's my goal. We'll see what happens. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, we can, thanks so much. So, seeing no other questions, I think, I'm going to call up Professor Cynthia Wallace, who's from the English department here at STM, to come give a couple words of thanks.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Nicholas, we are so grateful for your presence with us tonight. And on behalf of the Keenan Lecture Planning Committee, I'd like to offer you this gift as a token of our gratitude. And I would also like to invite everyone to express our gratitude once again to the Honourable Graydon Nicholas for his presence this evening.
Thank you very much.
I have a list of further thanks. This is my homework for the night. It takes a lot of people to put on a lecture, and so I want to express our thanks on behalf of the Planning Committee to the St. Thomas More custodial staff and IT staff, to the Marketing and Communications Department. I want to express my gratitude to my colleagues on the Keenan Planning Committee, and most especially Laura Mitchell, who does so much for this college and without whom this event would not have occurred, and so many other things. I'd like to express gratitude again to the Keenan family, and I'd like to express gratitude to all of you for your presence here tonight, to those of you who are cozy at home watching us remotely, and to those of you who braved our first, I think it's our first cold, icy night of the year, isn't it? So thank you for coming out. I'd also like to express gratitude to our catering team who has prepared a reception for us in the atrium, and I hope that everyone who is able to do so will join us there. Mr. Nicholas, tonight I heard you say there is a need to understand the past as we prepare to journey together. And I would invite all of us to go from here pondering in our hearts these histories that we've heard and seeking out to learn more as we've been encouraged to do, and to think about the urgency that it may not be another 20 years before these changes occur. And as we ponder, may that lead us toward something like true lament, and may that lament lead us towards something like true justice, and may that true justice lead us towards something like true healing. That would be the prayer of my heart tonight. So I invite all of you to go in grace until we are together again. And in the meantime, do stay if you can to join us for some refreshments and some more conversation. Thank you again, everyone, and good night.